Hey folks, welcome to Project Gamma. At Project Gamma, we have smart conversations with smart people across entrepreneurship, technology, and cybersecurity. My name is Warner Moore, and I'm a technologist and security leader who helped build multiple business-to-business software as a service companies who's passionate about modern cybersecurity practices. I'm also the founder of Gamma Force. At Gamma Force, we help tech and health tech companies with cybersecurity strategy by acting as their fractional security organization. Entrepreneur by passion and engineer by training, Michael Supeck co-founded several tech companies and then founded an angel collective. Michael's now serving as managing director of Ohio Angel Collective. Thanks for being here, Michael.
Thanks for having me, Warner.
So, Michael, you co-founded your first company in college and founded a couple companies after that. Share your journey.
Yeah, so I grew up in Cleveland and always loved computers. Going into software engineering at Miami. Miami is everyone in my family went there, Miami University of Ohio. And with my love for computers, I think software engineering was the one for me. Although I always thought entrepreneurially, I did at that time lean, towards the tech. So I went for software engineering, great school, great engineering program. And I had a friend that called me who had transferred from Arizona State, and he is a longtime family friend and said, "Hey, I have this idea. I won a couple of pitch competitions at Arizona State, but I just transferred to Miami. Miami's student-led venture capital firm, Red Hawk Ventures, wants to fund it, but I need a technical co-founder, and I know you're a software engineer." And so I said I didn't know much about startups, much about venture at all. And he said, "Do you want to jump on this bandwagon with me?" And I said, "Sure." He said, "Okay, well, we have about, a week before we have to do our final pitch to Red Hawk Ventures." So, we spent day in, day out studying it and getting ready for that. It was a virtual business card, like a Popple or a Link that you see now, those types of solutions. But we leaned really heavy into a lot of APIs and API access of the social media applications, which at the time were wide open. And I remember during our final pitch, they asked me, "What happens if they limit some of this access on the APIs?" And my answer was, "They won't. There's no way." And then 6 months later, maybe a year later, the Cambridge Analytica scandal happened. And overnight, they did, in fact, shut down and restrict a lot of that access. So it was an awesome experience for about 2 years. We raised some capital. We launched the product into market, and I learned a ton because it was a world completely unfamiliar to me, and it was scratched my entrepreneurial itch. So after I graduated, I did software consulting for about 6 months, and during that time, it was very apparent to me that focusing on the business side and building something myself was something that I wanted to do. As I was always looking at, my fellow software engineers that were on my team, the other developers, and I was making comments about the business and business decisions that were being made and the way that we were, constructing some of the engagements with the clients. And I remember one day a good friend of mine, he looked over at me and said, "Why do you care about this? Like, get back to coding." And I think right when he said that, it kind of clicked in my brain, like, "Oh man, I don't know if I want to, do this forever." So after probably being very annoying to my manager and walking into his office every day and saying, "I need more. I want to be in front of clients. I want more responsibility," he finally said, "Hey, you should really consider doing something else." And he meant that in the nicest way possible. He was an awesome guy. So I networked like crazy. I met a medical physicist, which I didn't know existed. He ran a physics consulting firm. He had an internal process tool that he used to calibrate radiology machines. I had no clue anything about that. And he said, "I think I could take this to market, but it would take a huge investment, probably a couple $1 million." And I said, "Oh, I'll go raise that for us and we'll co-found this company together." And he was like, "What's venture capital and who are you?" I met him at a networking event. I was 21, maybe 22 at the time. I ended up, kind of blowing him up via email, sending him a bunch of pitch decks unsolicited and business plans and saying like, "Hey, you should really give me a chance." So I basically convinced him to pay my rent for a period of time and allow me to go out and see if I could put together some capital for us to chase the dream. There were some very, very kind individuals at Rev One, namely Bethany George and Melinda Gloriosa and Ryan Helon and Parker McDonald. And there was a whole
Great
host of
folks.
people there that They were some of the only people to not laugh me off the phone call because I had so little clue what I was doing. They coached me for a while and ultimately led to Rev One leading the round. Tamarind
Wow.
Hill and some other Ohio-based investors came in. It was an amazing experience. So me and Brian Murray, my co-founder, we built that company together and had a great time doing it. I ultimately got to the point where I wanted to kind of take on the 0 to 1 journey again after about 3 years. I met a few folks that were building semi-autonomous ultrasound machines, Aaron Crooks and Jeffrey Toady. Joined forces with them and had a bunch more great experience doing that and getting non-dilutive capital and SBIRs
Hmm.
and the I-Corps program. I did a clinical immersion at Orlando Health. But ultimately, all that led to a conversation I had with a gentleman named Will Zell, founder of Asset Watch. He asked me, "What do you like to do? And all this experience you have, what do you like to do?" I said, "I love to fundraise." And he said, "You're nuts. You like to fundraise. It's usually the bane of most founders' existence." But for some reason, it just made sense to me and it was fun. And I actually enjoyed the process. So he said, you should be on the capital side. And I said, I'm a software engineer. I have no finance background. I've raised a lot of venture, but I don't know much about it being on the capital side. And he kind of jokingly said, looks like you got to build your own then. And he then, after a few more meetings, presented me with an idea he had for a free to join angel syndicate. But after just a few months of kind of building that as a side project, it became apparent that it was time to work on it full time. So I've been doing that for the last 3 years. We've since built a larger venture firm around it called Vessel. And it's been an amazing journey with a lot of great people, from my teammates to the founders we work with and the members of the OAC and all the ecosystem partners as well. So it's been fun.
Hmm. What a great story. Thanks for sharing. Few things really stand out to me that I want to just acknowledge real quick, and certainly like an amazing opportunity having that in college, because that learning experience of being a co-founder and getting some early capital and all the learning there is just huge. But what really stands out to me is just your tenacity of putting the work in, doing the work, and not giving up. And I run into so many folks in rooms like you described where everyone's so entitled and doesn't want to do the work, do the work, get the results, right? This is a difficult thing. Everything we're talking about, doing the work isn't a guarantee to have the outcome you want, but you sure as heck won't get there without doing the work. So I love that. And I want to come back to how you were trained as an engineer, but wanting to know why on the business side. Frankly, I cringe a little bit because I think all of us as professional specialists, areas of deep expertise, be it engineering or cybersecurity or business, I think that it's so important to know why, like have context for what we're doing. In fact, like those are most of the conversations I have with my team lately, and they might want to go deep into a cybersecurity problem, but I'm like, whoa, why? Let's contextualize problem and then decide how to solve it. So I think that's so important, but that pushed you out of engineering. So, but you discovered you liked the business side more. So let's talk about that.
I think that I thought about this a lot in hindsight because I do really enjoy sort of the logic puzzle that is engineering. When I took discrete math when I was in college, it was basically a course on logic puzzles, and like that's fun to me. In business, you have a lot of that too. I think my lean towards entrepreneurship and business is that it married the two ideas, with those two ideas being one, sort of that logic systems based thinking, and two, the people. I have a deep desire to be around lots of people, to get to know lots of people, to hear their stories. I find there's a word called sonder that kind of sums up to the idea that everyone has a life just as complex as your own. And that idea is like one of my driving forces in life. And this is going to sound goofy, but it's the reason that I love to yap with people when I'm standing in line at the grocery store. I cannot help but look at the person next to me and not just ask them how their day's going, but I want to know who are they, where are they from, what do they do, what drives them, what do they like, what do they dislike. Like that to me is my favorite thing ever. Business, you get to marry those two things. You get to kind of understand the downstream effects of the decisions you make, how that affects your bottom line, how that affects your team, how that affects the productivity of the business. And two, all the people, whether that be your customers or the members of the team. So I think that's where that lean came from. And in hindsight, as I look back and when I sort of started to realize that is when I was, at my software consulting job right out of school and having a deep desire to sit down with the clients more. We sat down in such a transactional nature. We did the demo, we got the feedback, we implemented it, and we ran that cycle every 2 weeks for the entire time. And that was fun, but I wanted to go to dinner with the client and sit down and really understand, like, okay, I understand that you want the UI to look like this, and this is the data that goes in, and this is the output that you want. But why? What's going on in your business? What if there are unknown unknowns that they're not considering? I wanted to go so much deeper, and I trusted that we had members of our team that were going out and eliciting those requirements and having those conversations. But I wanted to be part of those. I wanted to know why we were building what we were building. And that always, sort of comes back around to a bit of first principles thinking, which my partner Will Zell, he hounds on constantly. If you know Will, you know that he is a very much so a first principles thinker, and he's taught me a lot about that. And it's just breaking it down, almost like a child asking why a million times in a row. That is what I find myself doing constantly. I want to get down to the foundation, and I want to understand really all the way down, because that there's so many layers to most issues that once you start to break them down, you might realize like, oh wait, we're starting to stack some incorrect assumptions, and a game of telephone almost starts to happen up the layers where the decision that you're making at the top that seems so logical on the surface really isn't the right one when you break it down to really what is the need that we're trying to address at the foundation.
Yeah, I love what you say about people there. If it resonates with me, I've approached life that way. I like understanding people, hearing their story, and everyone has their own unique story, right? All my life. And I've had friends over the years that just didn't get it. And there are a lot of people who have no interest in other people's stories, but a lot of what I do and have done, it's because I like people. I genuinely like people, so that really resonates with me. What I do want to talk a little bit more is systems thinking, and we're talking about business and entrepreneurship and going from technology or engineering to that. And for me, I'm a technologist, but I find business really interesting, in part because people and humans are one of the more complicated things in our world, and business is something that's a complex system where we have limited control of the inputs and outputs. So good luck with that, right? Resilience is important. So how does system thinking come up with the work you do?
So with the work that we do now, it's at a surface level, it is simple. You find great companies and you find great investors, and we bring those deals to our investors and allow our investors to invest in those deals. But as you start to break that down, it becomes much more, especially with the problem that we're, specific to what we're doing now, especially with the problem that we're trying to solve, which is there are a massive amount of accredited investors, folks who are eligible according to the SEC to invest in startup companies. So in
There's over
Ohio,
27 million millionaires in the United States. And
that's
I that's a conversation I have with a lot of entrepreneurs, but if we step back and think about that and how it affects markets, things we do, it's nuts, right? There's a reason why lounges at airports are getting crowded. It's because of things like that. But please.
for sure, without a doubt. And a lot of those folks, made their wealth building something. And it's not just about there's 100 different things I want to say on this topic, but there's just as much as we want to encourage those folks to invest in the next generation of innovation. We also want them to, we don't just want them to invest their dollars, but their experience as well, their knowledge, their mentorship, their expertise, what they've learned about their industry, what they've learned about building a business and the difficulties that, that entails. So that's a really special thing. And so going back to your initial question around, how does systems thinking apply to business? For what we do now, it's just it's a cascading effect of when you really start to pick apart some of the deals that we work on. There needs to be co-investors in the round. We only write a portion of the check into the round. Who are the rest of those investors? Well, there's only so many firms in Ohio that invest in these companies, and they all have different theses. So once we sort of tap the network in Ohio, are there ones in other states? Well, how do we attract more capital to Ohio? How do we grow the angel collective? How do we educate our members? How do we educate founders? We do about a deal a month, but so that's 12 deals a year. But what about the other hundreds of companies, hundreds of great founders that are really building something? You start to realize like, oh, wait, there's a massive opportunity here. There's members of our team that probably get annoyed with me as I can't control sort of the vision that when we attack a small problem, I can't help but think about the system as a whole and the cascading effect that a decision has across the entire business. But I'm always considering that, how do we have this all-encompassing sort of machine that is making founders better, educating them on what they need to know? How do you educate investors or potential investors more, show them what's going on, bring in potential customers and big corporates and the universities and the state government, and it all works in this big machine of pre-existing relationships, non-existing relationships, and capital and knowledge. It becomes really interesting. That systems thinking has helped me a lot in sort of breaking it down. Like, okay, I have this innate desire to think a little bit bigger than I need to most of the time. But when I start breaking them down into components and saying like, okay, every component has an effect on another component, but do I really need to leave this box right now? Is that kind of a good use of my priority of time? But it's become fun to do that because we've started to, it's thinking in that system and always considering the system as a whole. It's allowed us to make very iterative progress over time in each of the categories, introducing new angel investors to the ecosystem, building relationships with other co-investors, matching OAC members that have a ton of experience in a certain industry with founders that are either ready to take on capital or might need a little bit of mentorship and advisory before they're ready to take on capital. And that to us is our part in pushing the innovation economy of Ohio forward, which we all care a lot about. Everyone on the team is born in Ohio, has raised capital in Ohio, is built in Ohio, and we believe we have a lot of the ingredients necessary to really make something special here.
I want to talk a bit more about the entrepreneurial ecosystem here, but first I want to come back to systems thinking because everything you're talking about is so important for scalability as an entrepreneur, as a technologist. I think the more common experience and skill set, folks are less inclined to do that, but it is sales in particular, right? But we still need a system in sales if we're going to scale a company, right? We often talk about and think about that as technologists. And something that hit me recently is the prototypical software engineer archetype, and the person's analytical, detail-oriented, focused on problem solving. And that's a really valuable skill set. But if we have somebody with 10, 20 years of experience with that skill set and engagement model, that approach to applying oneself is less congruent to the approach needed to using GenAI to code. And to me, like using GenAI to code, of course, need the experience to apply it and make it most impactful, but that's really more of a systems thinking type of skill set. And I think we're part of the friction we're seeing in some professional circles is the archetype that was necessary to get to where they are now is not necessarily the approach that's needed to make the impact with the new tools, which is a challenge. Like if we're a CTO, we need to think about that. How do we empower our team to be most effective with the problems we need to solve now? And you as a systems thinker thinking about business problems, what are your thoughts about that, using GenAI to code and systems thinking?
So I'll start off by saying that we have been considering this very heavily for two reasons, within our business, within the Ohio Angel Collective and our broader venture firm Vessel. One, because there's a massive opportunity to use it for internal process optimization. But two, in considering the investments that we make, how is software truly becoming commoditized? I mean, where we're at right now, did we really think we were going to be here a year ago? I remember a debate that we had amongst a bunch of venture capitalists about a year ago. We were wondering if the LLMs were ever going to allow, users to build on the application layer, like truly, kind of generatively build on the application layer. And there was a bunch of people at the table who were like, we're so far away from that. That'll never happen. The stuff that we are putting together was just lovable for like small internal process tools and now starting to become much larger process tools. And what I'm seeing other businesses do is crazy. But specific to your question, Warner, I do think that it very much so requires the ability to zoom out and think more about the architecture of how you want to solve a problem and the solution that you're building. So it's not just about, can you get down to the nitty-gritty and build this from a very specific sense, but you're able to do it so much faster now that you must have that ability to zoom out. And it's almost like it's moving the entire stack of a software team up in terms of level of detail, whereas do you really need to wait on the software architect of the team to really help you think about it? Is the software architect going to be responsible for thinking about the true architecture of the sort of archetype that we're used to in various positions in software development is changing rapidly? And do you see that, Warner, in your work and in the way that you're building teams now? So what did you look for in terms of ideal traits 5 years ago versus today? What are those biggest differences in the folks that you look for to be on your team?
Yeah, I mean, what brought that to mind is I've been, well, working with the team and applying these technologies since they came out, and before that in different forms as well. So doing R&D pretty early, and I've also been talking a lot with folks such as yourself, people who are applying these technologies and using them to solve big problems. And where I've seen the most impact is CTOs who are taking these tools, and CTOs who are technical, not just somebody who has a fancy title, and the problems they're solving with these tools. It's just so impressive, similar to what you're talking about. A year ago, well, it's changed a lot in a year. And it was me reflecting on the folks who were taking the technology and making the most impact that made me realize that. And they tend to be more systems thinkers because they're thinking broader than just how do I optimize these lines of code, right? So I think that's very true. But I believe that people who have decades of experience and approach problems a little differently still have value. The question is, where does that skill set and experience make the most impact? And I'm not sure yet. I just stumbled onto this thought only a couple weeks ago. So I'm still evolving my thoughts there, which is why I brought it up with you. I'm curious what others are thinking as it relates to that skill sets, team building, applying the latest tools in the most impactful ways. I've always been on the bleeding edge of tech, but tech changes, right? And I've seen people over the years who get to a point and they're like, I like this, and they stop. Well, there's not as much room in the world for folks like that, especially when things are changing even more rapidly than they have in the past. So I think as a technologist, we have the benefit of being able to help lead and drive change and apply these tools and build these tools. And I encourage everyone to think about how they can take their experience and their unique value, be part of that change as opposed to fighting that change. But I want to jump back to something we were talking about before, your work with the Ohio Angel Collective. And something I think that's interesting is you have visibility into most of the entrepreneurial activity, early stage activity in the ecosystem here in Ohio. And not everyone knows about it, but we've got a lot of great stuff happening here in CBUS Tech. Ohio is among the best tech markets in the country. What are your thoughts about the entrepreneurial ecosystem here in Ohio?
I think that the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Ohio we have great people here. We have very smart people here. We have a ton of great universities that produce great talent, and great talent that comes from folks that, don't go to one of the local universities or any university for that matter as well. But I think that the ingredients are really starting to come together. We've had a lot of the ingredients for a while. We're now starting to see them all sort of culminate in a beautiful symphony. And there's been, phases in terms of even, the innovation economy, you can call it the entrepreneurial, ecosystem in Ohio. But right now, what I'm noticing first and foremost, and this isn't just my observation, but as folks join the OAC, especially folks that, come to Ohio from out of state, that they move back here, they once lived here, and they, come back from San Francisco or New York or wherever that may be, I always ask them, what have you noticed and what's changed since you were here? Or if they've never been here, what do you notice the most about this? And I get the same answer, a surprising amount, which is they are shocked by how much people want to introduce them to other people. It's a very simple way of stating it, but I think that shows the amount of hunger that people have for not just the thing that they're doing, not just acting in a self-serving manner and a selfish manner, but more so that people understand that every cliche that you can, name about, the rising tide lifts all boats and all those types of things, people really do believe that here, and they want to see it. They want to see more capital be attracted here. They want to see this be a great place to build a business, which I believe that it is right now. And what we're really seeing over the course of the last 6 months or so, especially, we've been calling it internally like a renaissance of deals. Not to say that they weren't good before, they were great before, but we're starting to become overloaded with deals. We're like, whoa, that company's being built here. That founder is staying here. And I think that's another big thing is that Ohio has historically had a lot of great investors, whether they be angel investors or institutional firms. But those firms and those angel investors only have so much capital. They can't fund every company. So I think that what was being overlooked in Ohio was an exodus of founders that were, going elsewhere and going to the coast to find capital. And if they do that, they're most likely not going to come back. They're not going to go raise their pre-seed round or their seed round on the coast and come back for their Series A and then build here from then on. Most likely not. So what I'm now seeing though is as the existing funds raise, continue to raise more capital, as new funds continue to pop up, as more angel investors get involved in the ecosystem, and as additional support organizations like incubators and accelerators and different entrepreneurial support orgs, as that all happens, founders are staying here more often. And we're starting to see the quality of company increase, the magnitude, so the volume of those companies increase. And I'm really starting to see more interest. There's a number of firms that we invest alongside of in New York City, for example. And for a while, when I used to talk to them years ago, they would kind of, there'd be a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek sort of, some jokes to make around like, oh yeah, Ohio and the venture ecosystem in Ohio. But we're seeing it more and more that those people are reaching out over the last year, especially sort of saying like, hey, what's going on over there? Like, we know there's stuff happening. It's becoming apparent. Can we do deal flow sharing sessions? Can we see what you have in your pipeline? Who are the best companies that we could look at? And we're starting to get those eyes on us. So I'm really excited about what's happening, and I'm also starting to see another piece. I'm starting to see a lot of successfully exited founders understand that this wave is growing as well, and they're starting to recycle their knowledge and expertise back into the ecosystem, not just their capital. And same with angel investors, individuals that are investing in these startups. Even if something doesn't immediately benefit you, you're building an ecosystem that you then get to build in moving forward. And that to us has always been our thesis from the beginning. We always said that if the Ohio Angel Collective allows an individual who wants to invest in startups, if we welcome them in and we educate them and we make them feel comfortable and they end up becoming an LP of a different fund, or they end up joining a different group or whatever that is perfectly fine, because that is just more capital that is now available in the innovation economy. The rising tide lifts all the boats. We're building an ecosystem that then we get to build in forever. So I think for the first time, for me at least, in my experience, I'm now seeing a momentum that I think is going to carry us really far. I don't think that this is the cyclical nature that we've seen for a while. I think that's starting to fade, and we're really starting to see linear growth, and that hopefully that linear turns to a little more exponential growth in the future. But I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, I love it. A couple things stand out to me. One is anecdote, right? A 10-year overnight success. Every billion-dollar company, really any company of any meaningful success. It doesn't happen overnight. And the ecosystem here, it's been building and compounding for over 20 years. And it's building and compounding still. So and it's thanks to people putting the effort forth, the energy, and the community. And that's one of the things I love that you're building and helping and curating, Michael, with Ohio Angel Collective and Vessel. And that's in something that it's easy to talk about, the mechanics of it, but the values are often under-recognized. We often refer to it as the Columbus Way. You talked and touched a few points there tactically in the intros that are made without expectation and pretty easily. And those things are unique to Columbus and unlike most other startup markets. And honestly, probably the most often cited book on Project Gamma is Adam Grant's Give and Take, and it one of my favorite authors, but part of it is what you're describing is Adam Grant's a organizational researcher out of Wharton, organizational management, and he talks about science-based giving and taking in that particular book, and I'll simplify it as the Columbus way, giving without asking or being transactional or believing that paying it forward rises the tide and all boats rise with it. That's how we operate here. And that's what's growing and compounding the ecosystem.
I think that one interesting thing about, Columbus is that, Columbus is a great place to live for a long time. It's a great place to build a family. It's a great place to settle your roots. And not saying that you can't do that in big cities, but a lot of folks, in New York and San Francisco, they're more transient. They go in their 20s and their early 30s, and then, after they were able to build up a ton of great experience and build a great company or work for a great company, they then kind of look for a place to settle down. The Columbus offers an environment that is very conducive for that sort of long-term thinking. And that's, I think, one of the ingredients that leads to people wanting to contribute to sort of the environment or the ecosystem as a whole, rather than treating it as I'm going to get in, I'm going to transact, I'm going to extract my value, and I'm going to get out. And I also think that, with mass comes gravity, and the Ohio as a whole has such a propensity for relationship building and non-transactional thinking that it attracts the same, and it repels folks who want to come in and extract value and leave without contributing. Have you seen the same in your experience in Columbus and in Ohio, Warner? Would you concur?
Oh, very much so. I I'm here by choice. I've lived all over, and I made a conscious decision to spend time here, and I've been here for a long time. And while the city's growing so much, and we have people moving in from all around the country, and they don't always get it coming in, but they're here for a reason, and they usually figure it out. I will acknowledge too, Columbus is the 14th biggest city in the country, bigger than San Francisco, and just because of the way the city is composed, people don't always realize that it's big, it's spread out. Well, I thought I have, Michael, is you've seen a lot now on both sides of the table, founder and investor. What would you do differently as an entrepreneur, knowing what you know now?
I've seen a lot of those now at this point. I think that the biggest change I would make is seeing in terms of the pattern recognition that I've been able to do over the last few years of running the OAC. You start to see sort of the commonalities, the overlap in the Venn diagram for founders that are successful, that are really growing their companies. One of those things that stands out the most to me is a almost irrational bias for action. And I don't mean in a way where it's like put your head down and not paying any attention to anything around you and be a bull in a china shop. There's a level of calculation that you must have, but it's folks that they're not afraid to fall. They recognize that they're gonna bump their head on the wall 100 times, and you might as well get those 100 times over with as fast as you can, and it's gonna happen forever. But at the beginning, I think that I tried to be a challenge for me is that I was overly strategic. I wanted to over plan. I was skittish. I was scared to whether that be release a new feature set in our product or bring a new product to market or approach a new customer. I let perfect get in the way of good far too often. And the founders that I see that are very successful are the ones that are getting out there and putting themselves out there. They're moving fast, breaking things, and they're not afraid to fail in public. And what that does is that you kind of run through that iteration, the feedback iteration cycle very quickly, and you get a lot of reps in. And we always say that, one of the things that we love to see in founders the most is they allow the market to tell them what the market wants. And that a red flag is that when a founder thinks that they know what the market wants more than the market knows what they want. So when you're doing that, when you have a bias for action, when you're running that feedback loop very quickly and iterating very quickly, and you're releasing the product before it's perfect, when you're talking to the big customer that is your North Star, that you talk to them earlier rather than later, you realize that it's far more important for people to see you iterate and improve rather than just wait till something's perfect and then deliver it to them. We love meeting founders early, far before they ever, are ready to raise capital. And we get to watch them like, what are you going to do over the next 30 days? Well, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z over the next 30 or 60 or 90 days. And then we get to call them back or they call us back and they say, I did X, Y, and Z. Here's what I learned. And here's how I pivoted. And when we get to see that, then you can kind of extrapolate for the rest of the time. So if I was to go back, I think if I was going to sum it up in sort of one phrase, it would be, don't let perfect get in the way of good, and don't be afraid to fail in public. Warner, you've been a member of the OAC for a while. There was times when, we'll screw something up, we'll mess something up, and, we say, hey, this happened, we learned, this is what we're going to do better next time. And people have appreciated that so much more rather than me kind of having this veil of like perfection that I try to curate where everyone knows that it's not humanly possible. But, I think prior, as I was building companies prior in my career, I would try to do that rather than be more human and let people see that human side of I'm doing my best and I'm learning, but I'm learning quickly and I'm iterating quickly and I'm going to get better quickly. And that's going to continue to happen forever. So that'd be the biggest thing I would apply if I was to do it again.
Complex system where we don't control the inputs and outputs. Got to create luck. And that iteration, that bias for action, it's how luck is created. Well, thanks so much for being here, Michael. Do you have any closing thoughts or books or anything you'd like to share with our audience?
Ooh, books. I'd say that one of the biggest books that made a difference for me is a book called The Compound Effect. The reading the Spark Notes is probably the most efficient way to do it because there's just a few big takeaways from that, and that, is, how much your actions, these really, really tiny decisions you make, how much those compound over time and how much of a difference those can make over time. Another is the Naval or the Almanac of Naval Ravikant. It is amazing. He talks about money and the psychology of it and not doing things as a means to an end and how to use money as a tool, and covers all these amazing sort of topics in and around that. Those are two that I really like. And Startup Communities by Brad Feld, around how to build a successful startup community. But what I really like is that he uses an example, the community that was built in Boulder, Colorado. He kind of tells the story of how that came to be. So that was awesome. And lastly, I'd say that, if you're a founder building something in Ohio, regardless of your stage or industry, I would love to meet you. I would love to help how I can, even if it's a deal that doesn't necessarily fit our thesis and what we would invest in. I will always do my best to get you connected to the right folks and try to move the needle for you. And for anyone that wants to join the OAC as a member to see what's going on in Ohio and see the deals that are occurring, anyone can feel free to reach out to me. We're always welcoming new people on both sides of the table.
How would you like people to reach out to you, Michael?
They can either we have forms on our website, two forms, one on ohioangelcollective.com. We have a tab on there that says pitch for founders that have an idea that they want to pitch, or for members, there's a join or join us tab on our website to fill that out. And, we could schedule a call and talk about joining as a member of the OAC. It's completely free to join. And that's been our thesis from the beginning, and it'll always stay that way. So either one of those two work, or reach out to me on LinkedIn, is always an option as well.
Great. I'll make sure links for that are on the episode. Well, thank you all for listening to Project Gamma, presented by GammaForce.io. If you've enjoyed this podcast, check us out on your favorite podcast platform to catch future episodes.